Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have you here. My name is Karen Voss, and I'm a senior editor at Charlesbridge Publishing. And I'm here with three amazing authors today, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves to you.
Wanikisak Natasuis Pamachuan Nitomas Masipi Wampanoag. Hello, everyone. My name is Danielle Greendeer, and I am from the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. And I am here as the lead author of Keepunumuk, WEEACHUMUN'S Thanksgiving Story.
Chukma, I am Anthony Perry, and I am a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation living in England, and I am a co-author of Keepunumuk.
Shemai, everybody. I am Alexis Bunton, and my tribal affiliations are Unangan and Yupik from Bristol Bay, Alaska. I currently reside in Monterey, California.
And I just want to mention the fourth creator of this book who isn't with us today. His name is Gary Meaches Sr., and he is an amazing fine artist. And we were so pleased that he was able to bring his gorgeous artwork to the book. I want to ask how the three of you decided to write a book together to start with, because co-writing a book is not an easy thing. So can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to do that?
It all started in 2016, and I was at a dinner, sat next to a stranger, and we were talking about Thanksgiving coming up, and could we decolonize it? Could we eat all native foods? Could we change the narrative of Thanksgiving? So we held the first decolonized Thanksgiving dinner with must have been about 20 guests from all different ages, generations, walks of life, political beliefs. And from that, we went on to continue to spread the word about indigenizing and decolonizing Thanksgiving with another event where I live in the former capital of California. And the next year, I interviewed a friend of ours who's also written a wonderful book about the story of Thanksgiving, Chris Newell, who Tony and I went to college with at Dartmouth. And we had an interview about what really happened that people don't know when they learn about Thanksgiving. And from there, Tony, he came to me and he said, what if we write a children's picture book that disrupts the incorrect narrative and the stereotypes that children in America learn about when they first learn about Thanksgiving? What better age to teach people how to think about Native people and different political issues in this country than their very first exposure to it, so that it's a correct exposure. And I said to Tony, yes, absolutely, let's do it. So we started to go about trying to get permissions and contacting different people associated with the Wampanoag tribes in the Northeast. And then it was a little difficult. And one day I had a light bulb moment, and I thought, I should call Danielle. She's Wampanoag, and we had met working together on a consulting gig. And Danielle and I had a very special meeting because we met where my grandparents lived, and she got to know a little bit about where I'm from as well. So we contacted Danielle and we said, look, we're cooking up this idea. We're Native, but we're not Wampanoag. We can't tell the story. Can you put us in touch with the right people? And then Danielle said, well, actually, I kind of want to write children's books. And Tony and I were thrilled, and we said, can you be the first author? And she accepted.
That's fantastic. So Tony and Danielle, do you want to add anything?
So as Alexis said, I had seen her Facebook interview with Chris Newell, and I was amazed at how little I knew about what happened on the first Thanksgiving. I've studied these things generally, and I thought I had some idea, and I was just amazed at how little I actually knew. And at the same time, I had very young children, so I was reading with them nightly, and picture books played a huge part, and still do, frankly, in terms of our reading. And I realized then the power of story for the youngest of readers. So why not create a new story that presents an indigenous perspective on the Thanksgiving story, rooted in history, rooted in the primary sources that we have, and also the stories that were passed down amongst the Wampanoag peoples. And so to create a new narrative. And so that's what began this work.
I'd like to add that when Alexis and Tony reached out about the book and the idea, I jumped at the opportunity because I have been so inspired by the stories and the imagery from Native authors over these last few years who are telling their stories of their Native communities in their own voices. So I absolutely was like, yes, there is no Wampanoag author who is telling their version of Thanksgiving. So absolutely, I will totally be on board with this idea. And we worked together for the next 3 years, and it was a labor of love, and we are so proud of it.
And can you tell us a little bit about how Gary got involved through you, Danielle?
Gary Michis is a family friend, and he is Anishinaabe from Canada, and he's like a local celebrity around here. He lives in Connecticut with his family, but he is always just pumping out beautiful artwork for various tribal events. He's always creating posters for the powwows. I mean, he's just so available, and his imagery in the way he sort of translates the spirit of the indigenous people in his mind is so accurate that you believe that he's calling upon something within him. I mean, the way he just, creates these people, these women and these children and the men, the spirits is so beautiful. There was not one other person I wanted to consider for the book.
Yeah, I was when we first talked about doing the book at Charlesbridge, and you all mentioned Gary early enough that we were able to get you all on board at the same time, which is fairly unusual for a picture book. Usually the author's work is signed up first, and then much later we go looking for who the right illustrator is. But in this case, all four of you came on board together. And I think it was important to you all and to me and to Charlesbridge that this was a fully Native created book, that there would be no discussion about even the possibility of a non-Native illustrator being involved. And I think you all felt strongly about that from the beginning too, right?
Definitely. I mean, when I had spoken to Alexis and Tony, I sent them probably about 10 images of Gary's work. And I'm like, you guys, really, we should consider him and ask him first. And then we could sort of go out and see if there's any other artists. But we all agreed right off the bat, and it worked out really well.
That's great. So I want to circle back to what you all said in this first part about wanting to sort of to offer a different narrative about Thanksgiving to people in the United States. Now, there's always this conversation about who is a book for, right? Is a book so that kids can see themselves in it, or is a book so that other kids can learn to see other people? And I think you have created a book that does both really beautifully. But I think one of your main points in writing the story was really to awaken lots more folks about the Thanksgiving narrative, how we teach and learn that in the United States, how we really internalize it and claim it as our own without ever really critically thinking about how it has been given to us and why. And so I want to sort of turn it over a little bit to Danielle and Alexis now to talk a little bit about that original Thanksgiving story, where it comes from and why you, in particular as Native folk, wanted to mess with that in terms of literature for kids.
Well, the primary sources and the historical documents that we all have read and seen in various forms are only from the English perspective, from the colonist perspective. So even if we were to take what they wrote and regurgitated it, yes, it would be Native authored, but we're just translating back what it is they're telling us. So we played around with the idea in our early versions of the manuscript in a very conventional way, like, oh, the English came, or oh, the Native said this, or here comes Squanto. And we realized, like, this is still boring, and it's still not from our soul. It's not from our spirit. We're not really buying into this. So I do a lot of work along with Alexis in the food sovereignty movement. And we had this brilliant idea to tell the story through the perspective and through the voices of WEEACHUMUN, which is the Wampanoag word for corn. So we took out the he said, she said with the Pilgrims and the Indians and brought in this conversation and allowed the corn, the beans, the squash, the three sisters, all the animals of the land to give their account. And that really felt authentic to us because we were not only acknowledging that these sentient beings have life and memory, but we're also not necessarily agreeing with what was written from the English perspective. We're using just our common sense and what we know from our own historical accounts and using the three sisters to tell that story.
I think that's really an important note that you're making, Danielle, about, first source materials and how often we teach kids to go to first source materials. But what we often don't say to them is who wrote them, right? And not only who wrote them, but who might have been left out of these first source materials and not either didn't have or weren't given or were purposefully taken away the opportunity to add to it, right? And it's that old adage you hear about, the winner is the one who writes the history, and that it's so terrible to think of it that way, that so much of what we consider, well, that's what happened, so there's nothing we can do about it, is actually not critically looking at who was purposefully ignored, blocked, or actually erased from all of that information. So as you all looked at those sources and you looked at how to write a story, as you described, Danielle, that comes from this different perspective, from a Native perspective, from the perspective of the folks who were left out, how did that coalesce with, Alexis, your work on decolonizing and indigenizing the story of Thanksgiving?
That's a great question. I think that, yes, primary sources are biased, and there is also a stereotype about Native peoples that our oral histories that are passed down are incorrect, and what's written down is correct. And time again, oral histories have been verified by Western science, but why should we have to have that authority to verify our point of view, our histories, our understanding of science in the natural world around us? So colonization did create this ongoing settler colonization now did create this us-them divide when we're all humans in the end. So I think that that is an act of decolonization, taking out the us-them, false divides between Native and non-Native people. There, of course, race and ethnicity is real, and it's a social construction that people uphold by acting the ways that they do. But we were very concerned about making this book as invitational as possible. We tend to write for our children first. That's our primary audience. But then we wanted this book to be in every classroom in America. And I imagined, as we were co-writing, parents reading this to their children. And adults are much harder to get through to than children. So I thought, okay, what if there is a parent who never met a Native person in their life, and this is new material for them? How do we invite them in to want to read this over and over with their kids? And I imagine kids asking their parents or their teachers to read it again. So we had to be very careful about our language, thinking about what is important to teach our own children. And oftentimes if you grow up Native, bad things in history aren't sugar-coated. We hear and experience and grow up with a lot of things that children in more, you could say, privileged positions are blissfully ignorant of. We wanted to talk about the real things so that non-Native kids could learn like the way that we learn, but also still bring their parents along. So for example, when the Pilgrims arrived, there was I think about like 10 years of plagues and sickness that killed off many tribal members up and down the Northeast. And so we wrote it as 2 winters had passed since many of the first peoples who cared for WEEACHUMUN passed on to the spirit world. Those who were not taken by sickness found new homes to ease their heavy hearts and rebuild their lives. We had to carefully pick words like that so that it didn't sound like we were blaming a particular person, but that it's implied. And so we really wrote the whole book to not be didactic and just show the story.
Yeah, and I think that's always one of the major challenges of a story like this, right? As you say, the didacticism is really difficult. And also, I think the other piece, and this is something that I always struggle with as a white editor when I cross culturally edit, is that I have to really keep in mind who are we writing to, right? Is too much of the story there to help kids who aren't of this background understand the story? Because I'm not sure that's how we should be writing stories, right? We should be, as you say, Alexis, finding this middle ground where we tell the truth. You tell it from your own culture, you tell it to be truthful and honest for your own kids, and at the same time as invitational as possible to folks who don't know anything about that culture. That is an incredibly difficult line to walk, and it is much more challenging, I think, than most people understand or appreciate in the final product. And I think all three of you struggled with that. You worked through it. And then the three of you and I worked through it together too, where I sometimes asked questions where you all were like, yeah, you're editing while white right now. You need to stop doing that. And we need to go back to this. And that's really an important, I think, part of the process to make sure that the audience for the book is as wide as it can possibly be and still work for all of the audiences that you intend, right?
And I think that's an important point about having the broadest possible audience. And this is also a major reason why we chose to write as a picture book. We wanted a new default narrative for the youngest of readers, kids who may not have heard even the story of the Pilgrims coming on the Mayflower and so on. So this becomes their exposure to the Thanksgiving story. It then goes to their parents as something that they didn't know or didn't think about. It presents a new perspective for them. They then talk to other people, right? And then this supports the hard work that others have been doing to try to challenge the myths around Thanksgiving. So it all goes hand in hand. And so the idea, I think, for us was around ultimately and fundamentally creating a new Thanksgiving narrative. And that comes with the fact that the Thanksgiving story that so many of us have grown up with was itself a story that came from in the height of the Civil War. And then articles coming after that saying, oh, well, family coming together, the one time of year giving thanks and having turkey and so on. And then all of this has become taken in as the traditional Thanksgiving. And so, so this changes that story. And I think that's the fundamentally important part of what we're trying to do.
I would so much love to hear about kids this Thanksgiving in classrooms with your book, dressing as beans and squash and corn rather than the traditional, what we know they all put on their heads with the pilgrim hats and the feathers. Wouldn't it be great if they were three sisters crowns instead?
I love it. Well,
Yeah.
I just want to add, my daughter who's in second grade now, but she was in kindergarten when we started. She's probably heard the story 15 times. And this last Thanksgiving, she was helping to gently correct things she'd heard in the classroom. So it's already happening. And she understands food sovereignty and why we grow the three sisters together. And we grew them last summer because I'm very method in my writing. And we learned a lot.
That's fantastic.
And I can say for my children, this is the story that they know. So I was able to read this to them around Thanksgiving for us. They don't know the other story. They've grown up in England. And so I was thrilled to be able to present a new story and say, this is the Thanksgiving story. And they absolutely loved it.
That's great. So the book comes out in August, which is perfect timing.
I would just like to add that in terms of takeaways and what I would like these young readers to understand is that there was a first harvest meal between the natives and the newcomers, but the American holiday of Thanksgiving is something completely different, and it was created, not at the same time. And that for our future change makers and, these young kids who are learning more about Native Americans and who may not live in the vicinity of Native tribes, that tribal people are still out there, and they're still practicing their cultures and their life ways, and speaking their languages. And that this book is just encouraging young readers and parents to just understand the truth, but also learn more about the current living conditions and situations of tribes and tribal people. Because for the last 400 years since that first harvest meal, tribes have been treated very unfairly. And it's really important for us and other tribal nations to tell their stories.
That's great. Thank you, Danielle. Alexis or Anthony, do you have anything else to add?
I do. For the literary world people, one of the things that we encountered as this book was being birthed and kind of shown around is that people would assume that this story, as we wrote it, is a story that's been passed down for generations in 350 years. And I saw that assumption made several times. And that is a stereotype about Native people, that we live in the past and that our cultures aren't thriving and changing and always becoming. So this story, as it was written, we came up with the concept of the story being told from WEEACHUMUN'S point of view. And that does relate to a Wampanoag belief, and a belief that's widespread by many tribes across North America about the sentience of plants and animals and even rocks. But it doesn't mean that this is a story that's been passed down for generations. It is a new story, and it's how we keep our cultures alive.
That's great. I think that's a very important clarification for sure. I am thankful that you all wrote this book and that it found its way to me and to Charlesbridge. And I cannot wait for August when it's available on the bookshelves.